Caleb and Julian were not ordinary scrapyard workers. They were industrial archaeologists of the maritime world, brothers who made their living dissecting the steel giants that the rest of the world had forgotten. Their business, strictly a family operation, relied on a sharp eye for value where others saw only rust. Their latest acquisition was a gamble that pushed their finances to the absolute limit, the Iron Monarch. It was a decommissioned ocean-going tugboat, a vessel of immense power and history, built in the late 1960s to haul oil rigs through the roughest waters of the North Sea. However, the brothers hadn't bought the ship for its hull or its history. They had purchased it for the monster sleeping in its belly, a legendary Anglo-Belgian corporation, ABC, 16-cylinder diesel engine. This 5,500 horsepower beast was a marvel of mechanical engineering, known for its indestructibility and the high value of its spare parts on the international market. The plan was simple: tow the vessel to their dry dock, extract the massive engine block, strip it for components, and scrap the rest of the hull to cover the overheads. They expected hard labor, grease, and a decent profit margin. They did not expect that the engine itself was a vault. The Iron Monarch arrived at their salvage yard on a gray, rainy Tuesday, looking like a floating fortress of corrosion. As soon as the ship was secured, the brothers boarded, their boots clanking heavily on the wet steel deck. The smell of the ship was distinct, a mixture of brine, old diesel, and damp rot. They made their way straight to the heart of the vessel. Descending the narrow, steep ladders into the engine room felt like entering the stomach of a mechanical whale. The air grew warmer and thicker with the scent of heavy oil the deeper they went. When they finally stood on the diamond plate flooring of the lower deck, the massive ABC engine loomed over them, a silent cathedral of cast iron and steel, painted a peeling industrial red. It was even bigger than the auction photos had suggested. The sheer density of the metal was palpable. This was a machine built when fuel was cheap and materials were thick, designed to run forever. Caleb ran a gloved hand along the cold flank of the engine block. The salvage process would be surgical. Unlike a car engine, you couldn't just lift this out. It weighed over 80 tons. It had to be dismantled piece by piece, layer by layer, inside the ship, and then craned out through a hole cut in the deck above. They set up their heavy-duty worklights, casting long, stark shadows across the maze of pipes and valves. The silence of the engine room was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of rain on the hull and the hum of their portable generator. They began with the peripherals, the massive turbochargers and the cooling systems. It was grueling work. Every bolt was seized by decades of maritime exposure, requiring heat and immense torque to break free. As they worked, they fell into their usual rhythm, a silent communication born of years working side by side. "Hey guys! We are taking a quick break from this heavy lifting because we need your help to validate this massive tugboat purchase. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and we need to smash that goal ASAP. If you love engine restorations and maritime mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe right now. It makes a massive difference to our channel. Also, we want to know our crew. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching this video from. We love seeing how far our adventures travel. Also, if you want to support the channel directly, check out the Super Thanks button below. Now, let's get back to the Iron Monarch. By the second day, the brothers had cleared enough of the external piping to access the cylinder heads. It was here that Julian noticed the first anomaly. The maintenance logs, which they had found in a moldy binder in the captain's quarters, were meticulous. They detailed every oil change, every valve adjustment, and every piston ring replacement for 30 years. However, the logs stopped abruptly in 1982, followed by a 10-year gap before resuming with a new handwriting style. According to the paperwork, the engine had undergone a major overhaul and crankcase reinforcement in Hamburg during that gap year. But looking at the engine block, something didn't add up. The bolts securing the lower inspection hatches on the port side of the engine were different from the starboard side. They were not standard ABC manufacturer bolts. They were custom-machined, high-tensile steel bolts with a unique head pattern that required a specialized tool they didn't have. This was unusual for a commercial tugboat. Standard parts were used for ease of repair at sea. Custom security bolts implied that someone didn't want those hatches opened by just any mechanic. Intrigued and slightly annoyed by the delay, Caleb fabricated a tool using a piece of hardened steel and an angle grinder. It took him 3 hours to grind the key into shape. When he finally fit the makeshift tool into the first bolt head, it required a 6-foot breaker bar to turn. With a loud crack that echoed through the empty ship like a gunshot, the bolt finally gave way. One by one, they removed the heavy bolts securing the rectangular steel inspection hatch near the base of the crankcase. The hatch cover itself was incredibly heavy, far thicker than the standard specification for this engine model. When they finally pried the heavy steel plate loose and lowered it to the deck, they expected to see the massive crankshaft and the connecting rods bathed in black, viscous oil. Instead, they were met with a baffling sight. The interior space, usually open for oil circulation, was partially obstructed. Welded to the interior wall of the engine block, between the number 4 and number 5 cylinder bays, was a secondary steel plate. It was cleaner than the rest of the engine's interior, showing no signs of the sludge buildup that coated everything else. It looked like a patch, but it was welded from the inside, which should have been impossible without completely disassembling the engine. Someone had gone to immense trouble to modify the internal anatomy of this massive machine. Julian shone his high-powered inspection light into the crankcase. The beam cut through the lingering oil mist and illuminated the strange modification. It wasn't just a plate. It was a box. A fabricated steel compartment had been integrated into the void space of the engine block, cleverly utilizing the dead space below the cylinder liners. It was welded continuously, creating a watertight and oil-tight seal. The engineering was brilliant. To a casual inspector, or even a mechanic doing a standard oil change, it would just look like a structural baffle or a reinforcement rib, exactly as the logs had claimed. But to salvage experts who knew the weight and shape of every component, it was a glaring foreign object. They realized the crankcase reinforcement, noted in the 1982 logs, was a lie. It was a cover story for the installation of a hidden safe. The brothers looked at each other. They were no longer just scrapping an engine. They were breaking into a fortress. The location was genius. The only way to access this compartment was to drain the thousands of liters of oil and remove this specific, bolted hatch, or to cut the engine block apart, which no one would do to a functioning ship. It was the perfect hiding place for something small, heavy, and incredibly valuable. The question was, how to open it. Using a cutting torch inside a crankcase that had been soaked in oil for 40 years was a death wish. The fumes alone could cause an explosion that would blow the hull plating off the ship. They had to use cold cutting methods. They brought down a pneumatic chisel and a series of drill bits designed for hardened steel. The work was slow and deafening. The steel of the false compartment was high-grade, resistant to their drill bits. It took them 4 hours of drilling to create a series of holes in a circle, enough to punch out a viewing port. The air in the engine room grew hot and stifling. Finally, with a heavy hammer blow, the circular piece of steel punched through and fell inside the hidden box with a metallic clang. The sound wasn't the dull thud of steel on steel. It was the distinct, sharp ring of metal hitting something solid and stacked. Caleb grabbed the endoscope camera they used for inspecting cylinder liners and snaked the flexible fiber optic cable through the ragged hole they had just created. They gathered around the small monitor screen, wiping the grease from the display. On the screen, the LED light on the camera tip illuminated a cramped, dry space. The box was lined with what looked like asbestos cloth, a fireproofing measure. Inside, stacked tightly against each other, were several rows of metallic, rectangular containers. They were not rusted. They were dull, gray, and looked like military-grade ammunition cans, but slightly different dimensions. The camera panned to the side, revealing stenciled white lettering on the side of one of the cans. The resolution was grainy, but the letters were legible. U.S. Dept of State, Diplomatic Courier, do not open. The brothers froze. This ship had operated in the North Sea, but the markings were American government property. The date stamped below the text read 1981. This was Cold War-era material, hidden inside a commercial tugboat's engine during a fake overhaul in Hamburg. The realization hit them hard. They weren't dealing with a smuggler's stash of drugs or cash. They had stumbled upon a diplomatic shipment that had likely disappeared over 40 years ago. The fact that it was welded inside the engine meant it was never intended to be found by customs or casual thieves. It was a deep-cover transport. Caleb carefully withdrew the camera. They needed to get those boxes out, but the hole was too small. They had to widen the breach, and they had to do it carefully. If those boxes contained sensitive electronics, film, or unstable materials, one slip could destroy the find. They switched to a reciprocating saw, slowly carving a square window into the false wall. As the final cut was made and the steel flap was bent back, the reality of the situation set in. They reached in with gloved hands. The first box was incredibly heavy for its size. Julian strained to pull it through the opening, the metal screeching against the engine block. He set it down on the oily floor mesh. The seal on the box was intact, a lead crimp with a government eagle stamp. With a deep breath, Caleb took a flathead screwdriver and popped the seal. He unlatched the heavy lid and threw it back. Inside, nestled in dense foam padding that had begun to crumble with age, were not documents, but thick, clear plastic bricks containing a silvery white metallic powder, and beneath them, rows of heavy, gold-plated component parts that looked like they belonged to a satellite or a guidance system. But tucked down the side was a manifest envelope. Caleb picked up the yellowed envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt brittle, waxy to the touch, and smelled of stale tobacco and decay, a scent preserved for over 40 years within the airtight darkness of the engine block. He carefully unwound the red string tie, conscious of the grease on his gloves, though he had wiped them clean on his coveralls moments before. Julian stood frozen, the heavy flashlight beam fixed on the open metal container, illuminating the strange, translucent bricks of metallic powder and the gleaming gold components. The silence in the engine room was absolute, save for the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the overhead pipes and the distant, muffled drumming of the rain against the steel hull of the Iron Monarch. The brothers, usually focused on the price of scrap steel and copper, knew instinctively that the rules of their world had just shifted violently. Inside the envelope were 3 documents. The first was a standard bill of lading, but heavily redacted with black ink that had faded to a dark purple over the decades. The header read, Department of State, Diplomatic Material, but the destination was listed simply as a post office box in West Berlin. The second document was a technical schematic, intricate and stamped, classified/no foreign, no foreign nationals. It depicted a complex assembly involving the gold-plated components they saw in the box. To Caleb's trained eye, it looked like part of a high-frequency guidance array, the kind used in early satellite communications or, more ominously, in ballistic missile navigation. The third item was not an official document at all. It was a handwritten note, scrawled on the back of a German beer coaster, tucked between the official pages. The ink was blue ballpoint, hasty and jagged. It read, Vargas wants his cut. I welded it deep. Let them tear the ship apart. If I don't get the payment in Hamburg, the engine keeps it forever. Julian reached into the box and carefully lifted one of the heavy plastic bricks. It was about the size of a standard literal brick, but significantly heavier. He turned it over in the light. The silvery white powder inside shifted sluggishly, like dense sand. There was a label embedded in the plastic, PD 99.95% sponge. Caleb looked over Julian's shoulder and nodded slowly. Palladium. In the early 1980s, this was a strategic metal, critical for electronics and catalytic processes, but its value had skyrocketed in the modern era. If these bricks were pure palladium sponge, they were holding a fortune that dwarfed the value of the tugboat, the salvage yard, and their entire business combined. And there were 6 of these bricks in just the first box. The gold components, likely solid contacts for corrosion resistance in space or maritime environments, were merely the icing on a very expensive cake. The realization of the wealth was immediately followed by the realization of the danger. They were standing in a rusty tugboat holding a stolen Cold War shipment that had been hidden by a disgruntled mechanic named Vargas, who was likely long dead. The shipment had disappeared in 1982, and the Iron Monarch had carried it unknowingly for decades. The brothers exchanged a look that communicated a shared thought without a word spoken. They needed to get the rest of the stash out, and they needed to do it now. If there were trackers, decaying isotopes, or anything else in those boxes, they needed to know. More importantly, they couldn't leave millions of dollars of palladium inside a ship that was technically open to the elements and unsecured in a remote salvage yard. They returned to the hole they had cut in the false bulkhead. The space was tight, forcing Julian to lie flat on the oily grating of the deck, reaching his entire arm into the dark, jagged opening of the crankcase. He grunted with effort, his shoulder straining against the raw steel edge. The second box was jammed tight against the third. It required a coordinated effort. Caleb used a pry bar to leverage the stack from the side while Julian pulled. With a screech of metal on metal that set their teeth on edge, the second box broke free. They dragged it out, coating the floor in rust flakes and grease. This box was identical to the first, military green, heavy, and sealed. They didn't stop to open it. They established a rhythm. Hook, leverage, pull, extract. The physical labor was intense. The engine room was unventilated, and the heat from their work lights combined with the humid air made the atmosphere suffocating. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes, but they didn't stop to wipe it away. They were driven by adrenaline. Box 3. Box 4. Box 5. The stash was larger than they had initially estimated. As they pulled the final box, the sixth one, from the deepest recess of the hidden compartment, Julian's hand brushed against something else, something that wasn't metal. He paused, frowning, and reached back in. He pulled out a leather tool roll, stiff and cracked with age, covered in a layer of dust that had settled before the compartment was sealed. They lined the 6 boxes up on the engine room floor. It looked like an illicit transfer scene from a spy movie, incongruous against the backdrop of the greasy, dismantling-ready diesel engine. Caleb picked up the leather tool roll. It was personalized. Burnt into the leather were the initials HK. He untied the leather strap, which snapped instantly due to dry rot. The roll unraveled on the workbench. Inside were not tools, but a collection of personal items. A passport issued by the Federal Republic of Germany, a wad of Deutsche Marks that were no longer legal tender, and a small, black notebook. The passport photo showed a man with a thick mustache and hard eyes, Heinz Kruger. The profession listed was marine engineer. This was the man who had done the welding. This was the man who had double-crossed the U.S. State Department or whoever was moving this cargo. Caleb opened the black notebook. It was a diary, or rather, a log of the job. The entries were in German, which neither brother spoke fluently, but the dates were clear. April 1982. Hamburg. The entries became erratic towards the end. Caleb recognized a few words: angst, fear, verfolgt, followed, and a repeated name, the anchor. It seemed Kruger, or Vargas, as the coaster note suggested, was running from someone. The final entry was dated the day before the ship left Hamburg. It was just a set of coordinates and a drawing of the Iron Monarch's engine with an arrow pointing to the specific cylinder bay they had just cut open. Kruger had hidden the loot, intending to retrieve it, but something had stopped him. The fact that the boxes were still here meant Kruger never made it back. The brothers turned their attention back to the boxes. They needed to inventory what they had found before deciding their next move. They opened the second box. It contained more palladium bricks, but also sealed glass vials containing a clear liquid, suspended in shockproof foam. The labels were scientific notation, unrecognizable to them. The third box was entirely filled with stacks of uncirculated, consecutive serial number U.S. currency. 1980 series $100 bills. The sheer volume of cash was staggering. The paper bands were stamped Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This was intended as a payoff or operational funding. The cash alone was a life-changing amount, easily over $1 million in face value, but with the collector value of uncirculated vintage bills, it could be worth much more. However, as they opened the fourth box, the mood shifted from excitement to confusion. This box didn't contain wealth. It contained technology. Inside was a bulky metallic device that looked like a reel-to-reel tape recorder, but heavily modified with encryption keys and a ruggedized casing. It was labeled Norden Systems Prototype. Alongside it were several reels of magnetic tape in lead-lined canisters. This was the hardware. The palladium and the cash were likely the payment for this technology. The brothers were looking at a stolen prototype of a guidance system or a decryption device that had been the center of a botched intelligence operation 40 years ago. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the ship. Both brothers froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The sound had come from the deck above, near the main hatch. It wasn't the rain. It was the distinct sound of a heavy steel door being unlatched and dropped. They killed the work lights instantly, plunging the engine room into near-total darkness, save for the faint, ghostly glow of the palladium bricks that seemed to catch the minimal ambient light. They stood in the dark, breathing shallowly, listening. The Iron Monarch was supposed to be in a secure yard, locked behind a chain-link fence. But the yard was vast, and the storm provided cover for anyone approaching. They heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate boots on the metal grating of the upper walkway. Someone was on the ship. Someone who knew exactly how to navigate the treacherous, unlit corridors of a decommissioned tugboat. Caleb signaled to Julian in the dark, pointing toward the aft escape tunnel, a narrow, grease-covered maintenance shaft that led to the propeller shaft housing and eventually to a small escape hatch on the rear deck. They couldn't protect the boxes right now. They were sitting ducks in the engine room. They grabbed the leather tool roll and the envelope with the manifest, the only portable evidence of the find, and silently moved toward the shadows of the shaft tunnel. The footsteps stopped directly above the engine room grating. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness above, sweeping back and forth across the dismantled engine block. The beam paused on the fresh cut in the crankcase, the raw steel edges glinting. Then, the light swept down to the floor, illuminating the 6 open boxes, the stacks of cash, and the palladium. The intruder didn't shout. They didn't call out. There was just a low, static burst of a radio being keyed, followed by a voice that sounded distorted and calm. Target located. The vault is open. 2 subjects likely on board. Secure the perimeter. Caleb and Julian realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't a random scraper or a thief. The discovery of the engine room vault hadn't gone unnoticed. Somehow, opening that compartment, or perhaps the removal of the lead seals, had triggered a signal, or maybe they had just been watched from the moment they bought the ship. The dead Cold War operation wasn't dead. It was dormant, and they had just rung the doorbell. They slipped into the narrow, claustrophobic propeller shaft tunnel, crawling on their hands and knees through the sludge, moving away from the fortune and towards the uncertain safety of the storm outside, knowing that their lives as simple salvage operators were over. The Iron Monarch had just become a kill zone. The propeller shaft tunnel, known in maritime terms as the shaft alley, was a long, cylindrical claustrophobia nightmare. It was designed to allow a single mechanic to crawl along the drivetrain for inspection, not for 2 full-grown men to scramble through in a panic. Caleb was in the lead, his elbows and knees banging against the curved steel walls, slipping on decades of accumulated grease and condensation. Behind him, Julian dragged himself forward, clutching the leather tool roll to his chest like a lifeline. The sound of the intruder's boots on the deck plates above had faded, replaced by the amplified, rhythmic drumming of the rain pounding against the hull. In this narrow steel tube, the sound was deafening, a chaotic roar that masked their own desperate breathing but also made it impossible to hear if they were being pursued into the tunnel itself. The air here was stagnant, smelling of heavy gear oil and the metallic tang of old rust. Every movement was a struggle against the slick surfaces, their coveralls soaking up the black sludge that coated the floor of the shaft. They reached the end of the tunnel, arriving at the steering gear compartment, the lazarette. It was a small, boxy room housing the massive hydraulic rams that turned the Iron Monarch's rudder. Above them was a small escape hatch leading to the aft fantail deck. Caleb signaled for Julian to kill the small penlight he had risked using. They were now in total darkness. Caleb reached up, feeling for the wheel of the hatchdog. It was stiff, seized by salt and time. He braced his feet against the hydraulic machinery and pushed with everything he had. With a groan of protesting metal that seemed ear-splittingly loud in the silence, the wheel turned. He pushed the hatch up just an inch, letting in a blast of freezing wind and rain. He peered out. The aft deck was empty, washed by the storm. The intruders were focused on the superstructure and the engine room forward. They slipped out onto the wet deck, instantly soaked to the bone. The rain was torrential, a vertical sheet of water that reduced visibility to a few meters. This was their only advantage. The salvage yard was a sprawling maze of towering scrap piles, stacked shipping containers, and the skeletal remains of other dismantled vessels. It was an environment Caleb and Julian knew intimately. They had built the piles, they knew the shadows, and they knew the paths that didn't appear on any map. They moved low, crouching behind the Iron Monarch's towing winch before sliding down the gangway to the muddy ground of the yard. As they hit the dirt, a beam of intense white light swept over the deck they had just vacated. The intruders had cleared the engine room and were moving to the exterior. The response time was terrifyingly fast. Instead of running toward the main gate, which was surely compromised, Caleb grabbed Julian's shoulder and pulled him toward the boneyard, the section of the lot where they kept the jagged, sharp scraps of processed steel waiting for the smelter. It was dangerous terrain, a landscape of rusted knives, but it offered the best cover. They scrambled up a mound of twisted rebar and sheet metal, finding a hollow space beneath the overturned hull of a smaller fishing trawler they had crushed weeks ago. From this vantage point, they could see the Iron Monarch and the main access road. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. 3 black, unmarked SUVs were parked in a tactical formation near the gangway of the tugboat. Men in dark tactical rain gear were moving with practiced efficiency, setting up portable floodlights that cut through the storm. They weren't police, and they definitely weren't local thieves. They moved like a military unit. 2 men were guarding the gangway with what looked like suppressed carbines slung across their chests. Another team was carrying the heavy boxes, the palladium and the cash, out of the engine room and loading them into the back of the lead SUV. They were stripping the site. The speed of the operation suggested they had been waiting for this moment, monitoring the ship, waiting for someone else to do the hard work of cracking the engine block before they swooped in to collect the prize. Julian gripped Caleb's arm, his eyes wide in the shadows. They had lost the fortune. The millions in palladium, the vintage currency, the gold, it was all being loaded into those trucks. But they still had the leather roll. The intruders didn't know about the diary or the manifest envelope that Caleb had stuffed into his coveralls. The cleaners were focused on the heavy cargo. As they watched, a man in a tan trench coat, distinct from the tactical team, stepped out of the middle SUV. He held an umbrella and walked calmly up the gangway, disappearing into the ship. He wasn't there to carry boxes. He was there to inspect the site. He was the management. Caleb realized they couldn't stay. Once the ship was cleared, the team would sweep the yard to ensure no witnesses remained. Cleaners didn't leave loose ends. The brothers needed to get off the property, but their truck was parked near the main office, which was likely being watched or already searched. They had to use the back exit, an old rail spur gate that was chained shut and overgrown with blackberry bushes. It was a mile away, on the other side of the yard, through the roughest terrain. They began to move, crawling through the mud, using the piles of scrap as shields against the sweeping floodlights. The journey to the rear gate was a nightmare of physical endurance. They slipped on oil-soaked mud, cut their hands on jagged metal, and froze every time a light swept in their direction. At one point, a drone, a small, buzzing quadcopter with a thermal camera, whirred overhead, fighting the wind. They dove under a stack of steel plates, pressing their bodies into the cold mud, holding their breath until the mechanical buzz faded. The intruders were using high-tech surveillance. This confirmed that the Norden Systems prototype found in the box was the real prize. The palladium was just the funding. Whoever wanted that device back had unlimited resources. They finally reached the rail spur gate. The chain was thick, rusted solid. They didn't have bolt cutters. Julian looked around desperately and spotted a length of steel pipe lying in the weeds. He jammed it into the chain links and they both heaved, using the pipe as a lever. The rusted iron groaned, resisting. Behind them, in the distance, they heard the SUV's engines roaring to life. The team was leaving. But a separate pair of headlights was moving slowly through the yard, sweeping the rows of scrap. The sweep team. With a final, adrenaline-fueled grunt, the chain link snapped. The gate swung open with a screech that sounded like a scream in the night. They didn't wait to see if it was heard. They sprinted through the gap, into the dense woods that bordered the industrial park. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned and the lights of the salvage yard were a distant glow behind the trees. They emerged onto a secondary service road, miles from the main entrance. They were soaked, covered in mud and grease, and shivering violently from the adrenaline crash. They walked in the drainage ditch to avoid being seen by passing cars until they reached an all-night truck stop diner 3 miles down the highway. They didn't go in. They found an unlocked shipping container behind a neighboring warehouse, a spot they knew from their childhood exploring, and collapsed inside, out of the rain. Caleb pulled out the waterproof flashlight he kept in his belt and clicked it on. He looked at Julian. They were alive. They had lost the money, but they had survived the raid. Julian placed the leather tool roll on the wooden floor of the container. It was the only thing they had left of the discovery. Caleb carefully unrolled it again. He bypassed the German passport and the old money, reaching for the black notebook. The diary of Heinz Kruger. If they were going to understand why a paramilitary death squad had just raided their scrapyard, the answer had to be in these pages. Caleb opened the book to the middle, where a folded piece of paper had been inserted as a bookmark. It wasn't a handwritten note like the others. It was a photograph. A glossy, black-and-white print from the early 80s. It showed 3 men standing in front of the Iron Monarch when it was brand new. One was the man in the passport, Heinz Kruger. The second man was unidentified. The third man, shaking Kruger's hand, was younger, wearing a naval uniform. Caleb squinted at the face. It was familiar. He had seen that face on the news, aged 40 years, just last week. It was a face associated with a major defense contracting firm, a man currently running for a high-level government advisory position. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The theft wasn't just a robbery, it was the seed money for a modern empire. Julian pointed to the text on the page opposite the photo. The handwriting was shaky, written in a mix of German and broken English, as if the author knew it might be read by Americans one day. The device is not a guidance system. It is a key. The palladium is not payment. It is the fuel source. If they find it, they don't need the launch codes anymore. The anchor knows. The anchor is watching. The cryptic message sent a chill down Caleb's spine. They hadn't just stumbled onto a theft, they had stumbled onto a weapon. And the anchor, the code name mentioned in the first note, wasn't a person. It was an organization. And that organization had just recovered their lost weapon. Caleb looked up at his brother. "We can't go to the police," he whispered, his voice raspy. "The police can't stop these guys. They probably own the police." Julian nodded, wiping mud from his forehead. "So what do we do?" he asked. Caleb looked at the manifest envelope, specifically at the classified schematic they had saved. "We have the instructions," Caleb said, a hard edge forming in his eyes. "They have the device, but we have the manual on how to use it or how to destroy it. And we know who they are." He tapped the face in the photograph. "We don't run. We leverage." Suddenly, Julian's phone, which he had thought was dead, buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. It wasn't a call. It was a text message from an unknown number. The screen glowed bright in the dark container. The message was simple and terrifying. "We have the cargo, but our inventory lists a logbook. Return it to the main gate in 30 minutes, or we burn the salvage yard to the ground with you inside." They were being tracked, not by the phone, but by the proximity to the site. Or maybe they had been bluffing about leaving. The trucks were leaving, but the sweep team was still there. And they knew exactly what was missing. Julian stared at the glowing screen of his phone, the threat burning into his retinas. The message was a digital leash, proving that their enemies were not only physically present but technologically omniscient. Caleb snatched the phone from his brother's hand. He didn't hesitate. He placed the device on the rusted floor of the shipping container and brought his heavy, steel-toed work boot down on it with a violent stomp. The glass shattered, and the frame bent. He stomped again and again, until the electronics were nothing but a pile of plastic shards and silicon dust. Silence returned to the container, heavier than before. They were now cut off from the world, blind and deaf, but also untrackable, at least digitally. The destruction of the phone was their first act of war. It was a refusal to negotiate. They would not return the logbook. They would not surrender the only leverage they had against a force that commanded death squads and erased history. However, the threat to burn the salvage yard was not an idle one. The brothers knew that the cleaners viewed their business not as a property, but as a loose end. To these people, arson was just a sanitation measure. Caleb grabbed Julian's shoulder, his grip bruising, and signaled toward the back of the container where a rusted panel led to the adjacent warehouse. They couldn't save the yard, but they had to save themselves, and to do that, they needed a vehicle that couldn't be hacked or tracked. Buried deep in the dead storage section of their lot, hidden under a tarp and surrounded by piles of transmission housings, was their project truck, a 1978 Dodge Power Wagon. It was a mechanical beast, carbureted, devoid of computer chips, GPS, or OnStar systems. It was a ghost in the modern machine. They moved like shadows through the periphery of their own property, using the familiar maze of scrap as cover. The rain had intensified, turning the dirt paths into sucking mud that muffled their footsteps. Through the gaps in the towering piles of crushed cars, they saw movement near the main office. The tactical team hadn't waited for the 30-minute deadline. They were already pouring accelerant along the base of the wooden office structure and the main workshop. The site of their livelihood, the office where they kept their father's photos, the workshop where they had built their reputation, being doused in gasoline filled Julian with a cold, sharp rage. He started to move forward, a visceral need to stop them seizing his muscles, but Caleb held him back, shaking his head. To engage now was suicide. The only victory available was survival. They reached the hidden truck. Caleb pulled the tarp off, revealing the matte black steel of the power wagon. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and found the jagged metal key for the truck. He unlocked the door and they slid onto the cold vinyl bench seat. The smell of old vinyl and stale gasoline was comforting, a scent of mechanical simplicity. Caleb pumped the gas pedal twice to prime the carburetor and turned the key. The starter whined, once, twice, and then the big V8 engine roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the chassis. They didn't turn on the headlights. Caleb threw the truck into gear and drove blind, navigating by memory through the narrow service lanes of the back lot. As they crashed through the rotting wooden fence at the rear perimeter of the yard, hitting the public access road, a massive whoosh of igniting fuel lit up the night sky behind them. The rear-view mirror was filled with a sudden, violent orange glow. The office had gone up. The flames licked high into the stormy air, illuminating the skeletal cranes and the hulking silhouette of the Iron Monarch in a hellish tableau. They watched their past burn as they sped away into the darkness of the rural highway. They were officially ghosts now. No home, no business, no phone. Just a truck, a stolen diary, and a secret that was worth killing for. Caleb drove with white-knuckled intensity, keeping the truck on back roads, avoiding the main interstate where cameras and patrols would be waiting. Julian sat in the passenger seat, the dome light taped over to prevent light leakage, reading the stolen documents with a small tactical flashlight. He was cross-referencing the diary entries with the classified schematic. The deeper he read, the more the narrative changed. The Norden Systems device wasn't just a receiver. The schematic showed it connecting to a much larger array, a power grid or a transmission station. The palladium wasn't just fuel. The diagram labeled it as a catalyst for ionization. This was energy technology, something theoretical and dangerous that had been buried in 1982. They drove for 3 hours into the deep interior of the state, heading for the high desert. Their destination was the Rookery, a secluded compound owned by an old associate of their father, a man named Silas. Silas was a Vietnam-era communications specialist who had gone off-grid in the 90s. He was a conspiracy theorist, a brilliant engineer, and the only person they knew who could identify Cold War hardware without calling the feds. They turned off the paved road onto a gravel track that wound up a steep canyon. The truck bounced and skidded, the headlights finally cutting through the gloom to reveal a high fence topped with razor wire. A camera on a post swiveled to track them. Caleb flashed the headlights in a specific code, 3 long, 2 short. The heavy iron gate groaned and rolled open. They parked in front of a corrugated metal hangar. Silas was waiting for them, a shotgun draped casually over his arm, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. He was a wiry man with a gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't ask why they were there at 3 a.m. He just looked at the mud-caked truck and the terror in their eyes and waved them inside. The hangar was a chaotic museum of disassembled radios, server racks, and vintage electronics. Caleb killed the engine, the silence of the desert ringing in their ears after the roar of the V8. Inside the workshop, under the buzz of fluorescent lights, they laid everything out on a large drafting table. The schematic, the diary, the manifest, and the photo of the politician. Silas put on a pair of jeweler's loupes and leaned over the schematic, his cigarette smoke curling around the paper. He traced the lines of the diagram with a stained finger, muttering to himself. When he saw the reference to the palladium sponge and the specific frequency modulation listed on the Norden device specs, he stopped. He went pale beneath his tan. He looked up at the brothers, taking the cigarette out of his mouth with a trembling hand. He didn't speak immediately. He walked to a safe in the corner of the room, spun the dial, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, an encyclopedia of naval engineering prototypes. He flipped through the pages rapidly until he found a matching diagram. He slammed the book down next to their stolen paper. It was a match. The device wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a Project Zenith key. Silas tapped the page. The diagram showed a massive, underwater infrastructure, a series of repeating stations laid along the Atlantic floor during the Cold War. Officially, they were for tracking Soviet submarines. But the schematic the brothers had found showed a secondary function, a directed energy transmission capability. Silas grabbed a marker and began drawing on a whiteboard. He sketched the Atlantic Ocean. He drew the Iron Monarch's route from Hamburg. He drew the location of the underwater cables. The palladium was the key component for the power source of these stations. The device they had found, the one the mercenaries had recovered, was the activation unit. Without the unit, the stations were just dormant junk on the ocean floor. With the unit, and the palladium to jumpstart the decayed reactors, someone could take control of a massive underwater energy grid that could ostensibly be weaponized to disrupt global communications or, theoretically, trigger seismic events. The politician in the photo, the young naval officer, was the project lead in 1982. He had tried to steal the tech then, but the shipment vanished, thanks to the mechanic, Heinz Kruger, hiding it in the engine. Now, 40 years later, the politician was on the verge of immense power, and he had finally recovered his lost key. But he didn't have the codes. Silas pointed to the diary. Kruger hadn't just hidden the hardware. He had written the calibration codes in his notebook, disguised as engine valve clearance settings. The mercenaries had the gun, the device, and the bullets, the palladium, but the brothers held the trigger mechanism, the codes, in the little black book. A sudden high-pitched chirp emitted from one of Silas's server racks. A red light began to flash on a monitor wall. Silas spun around, his eyes narrowing. His perimeter alarms had been tripped. Not at the gate, but in the sky. Radar. A low-altitude signature was approaching fast from the south. A helicopter. They had been tracked. The truck was clean, the phone was destroyed, but Silas realized with a sinking feeling that the documents themselves might have been tagged with a passive RFID ink or a radioactive isotope marker, a common trick for high-value diplomatic couriers. They hadn't escaped. They had led the enemy straight to the only person who could understand the secret. Silas didn't panic. He hit a large red button on his desk. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the hangar windows. He grabbed a ruggedized laptop and a hard drive. He looked at Caleb and Julian and pointed to a trapdoor in the floor, hidden under a rubber mat. It was a tunnel, an old mining shaft that led out the back of the canyon. They had to leave everything. The truck, the workshop, the safety. They had to go underground. But as they scrambled toward the trapdoor, a deafening explosion rocked the hangar doors. The steel buckled inward. The cleaners weren't knocking this time. They were breaching with high explosives. The war had followed them to the desert, and the timeline had just accelerated from days to seconds. The shockwave from the explosion at the hangar doors hit them before the sound did, a physical hammer blow of overpressure that knocked the wind out of their lungs. Caleb, Julian, and Silas tumbled into the open mouth of the trapdoor just as the heavy steel shutters of the workshop buckled and flew inward like crumpled foil. Debris, smoke, and the blinding flash of stun grenades filled the space they had occupied seconds ago. Silas, the last one through the floor hatch, didn't panic. He slammed the heavy iron trapdoor shut and threw a rusted locking lever, sealing them into the darkness of the earth. Almost immediately, muffled thuds echoed from above. Boots hitting the floor of the hangar, the distinct, aggressive shouting of a tactical entry team clearing a room. They were in a mine shaft, a relic of a failed silver prospecting operation from the 1920s that Silas had repurposed as an escape route. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and stale nitrates, a sharp contrast to the burning chemical stench of the explosives above. Silas clicked on a red tactical light, illuminating a rough-hewn tunnel supported by rotting timber beams. He gestured for them to move, his face grim and streaked with soot. They scrambled down the sloping passage, their feet slipping on loose shale. Above them, the sounds of the raid grew fainter but more destructive. The mercenaries were likely tearing the workshop apart, looking for the tunnel entrance. About 50 yards into the shaft, Silas stopped at a junction where a bundle of yellow wires ran along the ceiling. He reached up, disconnected a safety pin from a small, jury-rigged box bolted to a support beam, and then pulled a heavy ceramic switch. A dull, subterranean thump shook the ground beneath their feet, followed by the sound of tons of rock collapsing behind them. A cloud of choking dust rolled past them in the red light. Silas had blown the tunnel entrance. He had just buried his life's work, his servers, his archives, his equipment, under a mountain of granite to buy them a head start. There was no going back now. The only way was forward, deeper into the desert crust. The trek through the mine was a grueling, silent march. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing Caleb and Julian to hunch over, their muscles burning from the tension and the physical exertion of the last 24 hours. As they walked, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, clarifying dread. Julian clutched the leather tool roll and the diary against his chest, realizing the terrifying efficiency of their pursuers. Silas paused briefly to inspect the documents Julian was holding. He pulled a lead-lined bag from his own pack, a photographer's film shield, and motioned for Julian to put the diary and the manifest inside. He explained through gestures and grim looks that the documents were likely tagged with a radioactive isotope, a Judas signature, used by intelligence agencies to track sensitive files. The lead bag would mask the signal, but until now they had been broadcasting their location like a beacon. After an hour of navigating the labyrinthine dark, the air quality changed. The stale dampness was replaced by a dry, dusty breeze. They saw a sliver of gray light ahead. They emerged from a concealed ventilation adit, pushing aside a camouflage netting of dried sagebrush. They were in a narrow, rocky canyon, miles away from the smoking remains of the hangar. The sky was beginning to lighten with the pale, bruised purple of a desert dawn. They were in the middle of the high desert wilderness, exposed and vulnerable, with no vehicle and no supplies. However, Silas had prepared for this. He led them down the wash, navigating by landmarks only he recognized, a split boulder, a dead juniper tree. About a mile down the canyon, he stopped at a natural overhang, a shallow cave obscured by a massive rock fall. He began to clear away brush and rocks, revealing the glint of metal. Hidden deep within the recess was a vehicle, a 1985 Land Rover Defender 110, painted in matte desert tan to blend perfectly with the sandstone. It was a mechanical relic, much like the Iron Monarch's engine and the power wagon they had abandoned. It had no ECU, no GPS, and no modern electronics to hack. It was equipped with extra fuel jerrycans, a roof rack, and aggressive off-road tires. They climbed in, the interior smelling of canvas and gear oil. Silas took the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he reached into the glove box and pulled out a heavy-duty, military-grade shortwave radio scanner. He extended the antenna and began to cycle through frequencies, listening to the static. After a few minutes, he locked onto a signal. It was an encrypted burst transmission, likely from the helicopter or the command team at the hangar. Silas listened intently, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't decrypt the voice data, but he could analyze the traffic patterns. The enemy was moving. They weren't sweeping the desert, they were mobilizing towards a new coordinate. Silas pulled a laminated map from the door pocket and spread it over the steering wheel. He pointed to the coast, hundreds of miles to the west. He traced a line from their location to a desolate stretch of shoreline known for its treacherous currents and abandoned industrial zones. He tapped a specific point, an old, decommissioned Lawrence Sea navigation station that had officially been shut down in the 90s. This was the Project Zenith control node. The device the mercenaries had stolen from the tugboat, the key, was useless without the transmission tower. The underwater cables needed a signal injector, and that tower was the only place on the seaboard capable of sending the specific low-frequency pulse required to wake up the dormant energy grid. The realization shifted their reality again. The politician, Sterling, and the Anchor organization weren't just stealing the tech to hide it, they were going to use it. They were going to turn on a tectonic weapon that had been asleep for 40 years. The diary entries about valve clearances were actually frequency hopping tables needed to synchronize the device with the tower's antique transmitter. Without the codes in the Black Book, the mercenaries would have to brute force the system, which would take time, perhaps 24 to 48 hours. But with the device in hand, they would be heading straight for the tower to begin the process. Caleb looked at the map, then at his brother, then at Silas. The dynamic had changed. They were no longer prey running for their lives. They were the only thing standing between a shadow organization and a global catastrophe. They had the codes. The enemy had the hardware. It was a race to the tower. Silas turned the key, and the Land Rover's diesel engine coughed to life, a rough, clattering idle that sounded like rocks in a blender. It was the sound of resistance. As they rolled out of the canyon, kicking up a trail of dust that would be visible for miles, Julian opened the black notebook again. In the growing light of dawn, he noticed something he had missed in the panic of the salvage yard. Tucked into the back pocket of the leather cover was a small, rusted key. It didn't look like a door key. It looked like an ignition key for a piece of heavy machinery, stamped with the logo of a crane or a lift. And etched into the metal of the key was a set of coordinates, different from the ones for the tower. These coordinates pointed to a location in a commercial shipping port, specifically a drayage lot where shipping containers were stored long-term. Julian showed the key to Silas. The old engineer glanced at it while navigating the rocky terrain. His eyes widened. He recognized the type of key. It was a master override for a specific type of dockside crane system used in the 80s, but the coordinates were for a specific container slot. Heinz Kruger, the mechanic who hid the palladium, hadn't just hidden the fuel and the codes. He had a backup plan. He had a stash. A Plan B, hidden in plain sight in a shipping container that had likely been sitting in a customs bondyard for 4 decades, paid up in advance or forgotten by the bureaucracy. They had a choice. Go directly to the tower and try to intercept a paramilitary army with a shotgun and a wrench, or take a detour to the shipping port to see what Kruger had left behind. Silas argued that going to the tower empty-handed was suicide. They needed leverage, or firepower, or whatever was in that container. Caleb agreed. They would go to the port first. It was on the way to the coast, a dangerous detour into civilization where cameras and police would be waiting, but necessary. They hit the tarmac of a secondary highway as the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in burning orange light. They were 3 men in a 40-year-old truck, carrying the secrets of the Cold War, hunted by a future vice president, racing to open a shipping container that might hold their salvation or their doom. The chase was on, but now they had a destination. The Iron Monarch had been the beginning, but the real mystery was waiting for them in Container 44 Bravo at the port of Long Beach. The journey to the port of Long Beach was a blur of tension and speed. Silas drove the Land Rover with surgical precision, bypassing way stations and security checkpoints using old service roads. When they finally located the drayage lot, a forgotten corner of the massive port filled with rusted containers from defunct shipping lines, the sun was high and hot. They found Container 44 Bravo buried deep in a stack. Using the key from the diary, Caleb unlocked the heavy padlock, which snapped open with a sharp crack of yielding rust. They swung the doors open, expecting machinery. Instead, they found Heinz Kruger's true legacy. The container wasn't a workshop, it was an insurance policy. Inside, perfectly preserved, were racks of reel-to-reel tapes recording every order given by the Anchor in 1982, proving the treason of the politician Sterling. But more importantly, sitting on a pallet in the center, was a heavy wooden crate marked ballast. Caleb pried it open. It was filled with gold bars, Kruger's stolen retirement fund that he never got to spend. There was no time to celebrate. Silas monitored the radio. The signal from the mercenaries was spiking. They were at the Lawrence C. Tower, preparing to insert the palladium and activate the device. They didn't need to go to the tower to fight a private army. They just needed to be within range. Silas realized that Kruger's diary didn't just contain activation codes. The last page contained a destruct sequence, a feedback loop frequency designed to overload the palladium reaction if the creator was double-crossed. They didn't need to storm the tower. They just needed to broadcast that signal louder than the tower could transmit. They drove the Land Rover to a high bluff overlooking the coastline, miles from the tower but with a clear line of sight. Through binoculars, they could see the black SUVs and the mercenaries swarming the base of the massive antenna. Silas hooked up his military-grade transmitter to the Land Rover's battery and the high-gain antenna on the roof. Julian read the frequency coordinates from the Black Book, his finger tracing the trembling numbers. Caleb loaded the gold from the container into the truck, securing their future while Silas secured the world. As the mercenaries at the tower initiated the sequence, a blue halo of light began to pulse around the stolen device. The ground vibrated. The underwater grid was waking up. Silas slammed the switch on his transmitter, broadcasting the destruct code on the exact harmonic frequency of the palladium. The result was instantaneous. The blue light at the tower turned a violent, blinding white. The feedback loop caused the palladium sponge to energize uncontrollably. There was no nuclear explosion, but a massive thermal discharge. The stolen device on the tower base melted into slag in seconds, destroying the interface and fusing the millions of dollars of palladium into a worthless lump of radioactive glass. The shock wave of the electrical discharge blew the tower's transformers, sending the mercenaries scrambling in panic as their equipment caught fire. The Project Zenith key was destroyed forever. The Anchor's plan was dead. Sterling's empire was next. The brothers anonymously mailed the tapes from the container to 3 major news networks and the FBI. Within a week, the scandal broke, destroying the politician's career and exposing the shadow organization. Caleb and Julian, officially deceased in the salvage yard fire, disappeared into the expanse of the American West. They used the gold from Kruger's container, valued at over $4 million, to buy a massive plot of land in Montana. There, they built a new, state-of-the-art restoration facility, far from the ocean and its secrets. They had bought a tugboat for scrap, lost everything, and walked away with a fortune and a story they could never tell. The Iron Monarch was gone, but the brothers had survived the wreck.